You've heard stories of war, but Stalingrad was different. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a graveyard that refused to rest. If you're ready to walk those ruined streets with me, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is not written in the history books. August 1942. The Germans were closing in on the Volga, and our orders were clear: hold Stalingrad, no matter the cost. We marched through a city already half in ruins, smoke hanging in the sky like a funeral shroud. Entire blocks had been flattened by bombs, twisted tram lines jutted from the rubble like broken bones, and the acrid stench of burning oil seeped into our clothes. I was 22 then, a private in the 62nd Army. The city felt endless, a labyrinth of shattered walls, gutted factories, and basements where civilians clung to life. The women and children who hadn't escaped huddled in cellars, their faces pale in the flickering light of oil lamps. Their eyes didn't look at us, not really. They looked through us, as if they already knew what fate awaited the men sent to fight here. Our squad was assigned to the northern districts, near the ruins of the tractor factory. The Volga thundered in the distance, its waters our last line of supply. Barges came at night, carrying reinforcements and dragging away the wounded. I remember watching the dark shapes of boats crossing under German fire. Each one seemed a miracle, and each one carried men who might not live to see the next dawn. But it wasn't the Germans who first unsettled me. It was the silence. Not true silence, of course. The artillery never stopped. But between the blasts, between the screams, there was a stillness that pressed in on us. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath and wonder if something is listening. The first time I noticed it was in the basement of a collapsed apartment building. We were setting up a firing position through a hole in the wall. Dust still hung in the air, and the plaster smelled of damp rot. I was checking my rifle when I heard it, the sound of boots crunching on broken glass upstairs. I froze. My comrade Petrov froze too. We both aimed at the staircase, but no one came down. When we went to check, there was nothing there. Just shattered rooms, burned wallpaper peeling from the walls, and a dead cat stiff in the corner. We laughed it off, nervous and tense. Maybe it's the ghosts of Stalingrad, Petrov muttered. I rolled my eyes, but the words stuck with me. Even then, before the real nightmare began, something about this city felt wrong. That night, we bivouacked in a cellar with a group of civilians. The air was thick with smoke and fear. A little girl kept staring at me from the corner. She whispered something to her mother, but I couldn't catch the words. When I asked, the woman just shook her head and pulled her child closer. Outside, the Germans shelled us again. The building trembled with every impact, plaster snowing down from the ceiling. Between barrages, I thought I heard voices drifting down the stairwell, whispers like men talking in low tones. But when I went up to the first floor, there was nothing but moonlight spilling through shattered windows. I told myself it was exhaustion. My hands were shaking from adrenaline and hunger. But in the pit of my stomach, a thought began to grow, a thought I couldn't shake. Maybe Petrov was right. Maybe Stalingrad really did have ghosts.
Stalingrad didn't sleep. Not in daylight, not in darkness. By day, the artillery turned streets into smoke-choked canyons. By night, we crept through shadows, listening for the crunch of German boots on broken stone. But somewhere in between,
When the guns fell silent for an hour, the city made its own sounds. The first whisper came when we were digging firing positions near a collapsed apartment block. The building leaned at a crooked angle, as if one more shell would finish the job. We worked with frozen hands, scraping rubble away to make room for the machine gun. That's when I heard it. A voice, clear enough to recognize words, though I couldn't place the language. It wasn't German, it wasn't Russian either. It was like murmurs in a church service, low and steady, coming from beneath the ground. I dropped my shovel and crouched, pressing my ear against the cold concrete. Petrov noticed, scowled at me, then did the same. After a moment, he jumped back, face pale, muttering, "It's nothing. Just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, a pattern, like dozens of people whispering all at once, their voices twined together beneath our feet. That night, none of us slept. We crammed into the basement of a different building, the stink of damp and rot making our eyes water. The civilians huddled in one corner, women clutching their children close, while we tried to rest against the crumbling walls. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers returned, not outside, not above, but in my head, as if the city itself was breathing through me. At first, I thought it was just my nerves, until Petrov woke me with a rough shake. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. His eyes were wide, frantic. I nodded. He wasn't alone. All along the basement, the men shifted uneasily, glancing at the ceiling and doorways. Someone muttered prayers under their breath. The little girl from before sat up suddenly and whispered a name. I froze when I heard it, because it was my name. Her mother hushed her quickly, pulling her into her arms. But the girl's eyes stayed on me, unblinking. The next day, while we scavenged for food in the ruins, the whispers followed. In a stairwell filled with dust, I heard my dead brother's voice calling me from the top floor. He had been killed near Smolensk the year before. My legs went weak, and I nearly ran up the steps before Petrov dragged me back, cursing. "You'll get yourself killed chasing shadows," he growled. But I saw the look in his eyes. He had heard something too, and we weren't the only ones. Rumors spread through the ranks, men vanishing in bombed-out houses, lured by voices they swore belonged to comrades or family. Whole patrols lost because they followed cries for help into the night. The commissars called it cowardice, desertion, or madness. They threatened us with execution if we spoke about it. But the more they silenced us, the louder the city seemed to become. By late September, Stalingrad was a maze of fire and ruin, but worse than the enemy outside were the unseen things inside. I began to wonder, maybe the whispers weren't leading us astray. Maybe they were leading us somewhere we were meant to go. And that thought was worse than any shell, any bullet, because it meant Stalingrad wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The Volga was our lifeline. Every night, barges crept across the river under fire, bringing reinforcements and dragging the wounded back. The water was black, wide, and merciless. We were told, hold the West Bank, no matter the cost. If the Germans took the river, the city would starve, and we would die with it. But there were nights when the river itself felt like an enemy. I remember one evening in September. The Germans had shelled the crossing all day, and by dusk, the water boiled with smoke and debris. Our squad was ordered to patrol the banks, rifles slung low, eyes sharp for saboteurs. The air was damp, thick with fog rolling in from the water. The fog swallowed everything. You couldn't see 3 meters ahead. Shapes blurred, shadows stretched and bent. It was as if the city and the river had fused into a single grey mass. That's when I heard it. A voice. My brother's voice. "Kolya," it called. My name, plain as day. I froze mid-step, rifle heavy in my hands. The others kept moving, their figures dissolving into mist. The voice came again, closer this time. I swear I saw him, standing waist-deep in the water, his uniform soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. My brother, who had died at Smolensk, reached out to me. "Come," he whispered. "Help me." I stumbled toward the riverbank, before Petrov's hand clamped onto my shoulder. His grip was iron, his voice shaking. "Don't! Don't look behind us," another soldier screamed. We spun to see him wading into the river, eyes wide, arms stretched as if greeting an old friend. The fog swallowed him whole. We ran forward, but by the time we reached the water, there was no splash, no ripple, no trace at all. Just fog, just silence. Later that night, as we huddled around a fire, the men whispered about others who had been lured into the river. They spoke of drowned comrades walking out of the water, pale and dripping, calling to the living. Some claimed the Germans had spread chemicals to break our minds. Others said it was the souls of the dead, too many for the Volga to carry away. I didn't tell them what I had seen. I didn't tell them I had nearly followed. But in the weeks that followed, I saw the same figure again and again in the fog. Sometimes it was my brother. Sometimes it was my mother, her hands outstretched. Once, I swore it was a girl I had loved back in Rostov, her dress floating around her like a shroud. Every time, Petrov was there to pull me back. Every time, I cursed him for it, and thanked him later. The Volga took men without a sound. Whole squads vanished in its fog. And though we told ourselves it was German snipers or artillery, I knew better. The river wasn't just a barrier, it was a graveyard, and the graveyard was calling us home. Stalingrad wasn't a city anymore, it was a carcass, and the factories were its bones. We fought street to street, room to room, but the worst of it was in the factories, the barricade, the Red October, the tractor plant, hulking giants of steel and brick, their walls shattered, their roofs torn away, yet still towering above the ruins like guardians of hell. By October, the fighting had turned the Red October factory into a slaughterhouse. We moved through rusted machines, molten slag frozen in mid-spill, conveyor belts twisted like corpses. Every corner could hide a German, every stairwell a sniper. The air stank of oil, sweat, and blood. It was in that place I saw the dead truly rise. At first, I thought it was smoke, shapes drifting in the distance as artillery fire lit the sky through holes in the roof. But then the shapes grew clearer. A worker in overalls, his chest caved in, stumbling past us without a glance. A soldier aflame, screaming, yet moving soundlessly, as though replaying a memory no one could hear. They weren't attacking us. They weren't even aware of us. They were trapped. Petrov was the first to say it aloud. They're reliving their last moments. I laughed, harsh and desperate. You're seeing things. But deep inside, I knew he was right. That night, we bivouacked in one of the assembly halls. The roof was gone. Snow drifted down on twisted steel frames. I lay awake, listening to the groans of the wounded and the distant boom of artillery. Then I heard footsteps. I sat up, rifle ready. There, between the gutted machines, marched a line of men. Red Army soldiers, uniforms scorched, rifles clutched in skeletal hands. They didn't look at us. They just marched into the darkness, one after another, until they faded into smoke. The men around me didn't speak. No one dared. But the next morning, one soldier swore he saw German troops too, shadows of them, walking the same paths, screaming wordless orders, falling to invisible fire. Enemy and ally, both repeating their deaths, bound to the same ruins. As the weeks went on, the shadows grew bolder. Once, in the heat of battle, I swore I saw a dead comrade rise in the middle of the firefight. His uniform was blackened, his eyes hollow. The Germans fired on him too, but the bullets passed through as though he were made of smoke. And then he was gone. Petrov muttered that the city was eating us, that the dead weren't leaving, they were multiplying. Each soldier who fell didn't rest. He became another shadow haunting the ruins. The commissars called it madness, exhaustion, tricks of the light. But when I looked into the eyes of the men around me, I knew we all saw the same thing. Stalingrad wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a theater of the dead, and every night the play repeated itself over and over until none of us could tell the difference between the living and the ghosts. And in the back of my mind, a terrible thought gnawed at me. When my time came, would I walk these halls forever too? By November, hunger gnawed harder than any German bullet. We had no bread, no meat, no supplies. Rats were hunted as fiercely as enemy patrols. Some nights, I dreamt of food so vividly I woke with my mouth watering, only to find nothing but snow and frostbitten fingers. The hunger wasn't just in our stomachs, it was in our bones, our blood, our minds. Men muttered nonsense, laughed at shadows, or wept for mothers long gone. But the worst were the hallucinations. Because in Stalingrad, you couldn't tell if they were madness or something real. One night, Petrov shook me awake. "Kolya," he whispered, voice thin. "Do you smell it?" At first I thought he was raving, but then I smelled it too. Fresh bread, warm, soft, crust crackling. The scent filled the cellar, impossible, intoxicating. We stumbled into the stairwell, rifles forgotten, following our noses. On the first floor, I saw her, my mother, standing in the doorway of a shattered apartment, holding a loaf of bread in her hands. Steam rose from it, her eyes kind and warm like I remembered from childhood. I reached for her, but Petrov grabbed me, shaking his head violently. "It's not real," he hissed. When I looked back, the doorway was empty, just rubble, ash, and cold wind. Later, another comrade swore he saw his wife crouched in a burned kitchen, stirring a pot over a phantom stove. Another heard his dead son laughing in a stairwell. The city was feeding us scraps of hope, just enough to drive us mad. And then there were the shadows. They grew stronger as our hunger did. At night, I saw figures squatting beside us, pale hands reaching into our satchels, clawing through for food that wasn't there. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and I swore I heard them chewing. When I told Petrov, he said nothing. He only crossed himself and muttered prayers under his breath. Some men gave in completely. One soldier wandered into the ruins, chasing the sound of a baby crying. We never saw him again. Another started setting out crusts of bread on the windowsill for the others. When we asked who, he only smiled with cracked lips and said, "They eat too." The line between starvation and haunting blurred until I couldn't tell what was madness and what was real. But deep down, I knew the truth. The city wasn't just killing us, it was feeding on us. Each pang of hunger, each hallucination, each ghostly vision, They weren't random. They were deliberate. The shadows wanted us weak, delirious, willing to follow them into the ruins. I lay awake at night, stomach twisting, body trembling, as whispers drifted from the walls. I told myself, "Hold on, Kolya, just hold on." But the thought returned, night after night, gnawing as hard as hunger itself. What if holding on meant I'd never be allowed to leave? Stalingrad had many names. We called one stretch of broken streets Sniper Alley. The Germans called it Todesstrasse, Death Street. Every window, every crack in the wall, every pile of rubble could hide a scope. Crossing it in daylight was suicide. But there were nights when even the best snipers admitted the enemy they fought wasn't entirely human. Petrov and I took turns on overwatch near the factory ruins, rifles set on shattered windowsills. The moonlight barely reached the street below, where blown-out tramcars lay frozen in snow. For hours, we waited, silent, watching. That's when I saw him, a German sniper, plain as day, in a second-floor window across the street. Scope glinting, helmet low, rifle steady. My heart hammered. I lined up the shot, held my breath, and squeezed the trigger. The figure jerked back, and then dissolved. Not like a man falling, like smoke unraveling into the air. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes. Maybe I had missed, maybe the shot kicked dust into my vision. But when I peered again, the window was empty. Minutes later, the crack of a rifle split the night. A bullet hissed past my cheek, close enough to tear my scarf. I ducked, swore, and scanned with shaking hands. No muzzle flash, no outline, nothing. Petrov whispered, "You saw him too, didn't you?" I didn't answer. Over the weeks, the stories spread. Men swore they had shot the same sniper 5, 6, 10 times, only for him to return night after night. Others claimed they saw phantom marksmen crouched in impossible places, on crumbled walls too thin to hold weight, on beams hanging in midair. One soldier swore he locked eyes through his scope with a German sniper whose face was half gone, as if already dead. When he fired, the ghost fired too. The man screamed and dropped his rifle, cheeks scorched as though grazed by a bullet that shouldn't exist. That night, I took position alone. Snow drifted down, silent, soft. My breath froze in the air. Across the ruins, I saw him again, a figure in grey, rifle raised, scope glinting in the moonlight. I aimed, he aimed. We moved in perfect rhythm, like mirrors. My heart stopped when I realized he wasn't across from me. He was me, my stance, my rifle, my coat, my face. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang, my shoulder kicked. The figure vanished. But when I looked down, I saw the bullet had struck the wall not far from my own head. For hours after, I sat trembling, finger locked on the trigger, waiting for him to return. He never did. But the feeling never left me, that somewhere in the ruins, another version of myself still crouched, still waiting, forever locked in a duel with a shadow. In Stalingrad, even the dead could shoot back. And sometimes, the dead wore your own face. There are nights that never leave you, nights that echo forever in your head, long after the war is over. For me, it was the night the whole city screamed. It began quietly, too quietly. The shelling stopped. No artillery, no mortars, no gunfire. Just silence, heavy as a coffin lid. We thought maybe the Germans were regrouping. Some men even dared to hope. But then it began. A cry, high, sharp, echoing across the ruins. At first I thought it was a woman. Then another joined it, and another. Soon the sound rolled over the city in waves. Screams, thousands of them. They came from the basements, The alleys, the burned-out factories. They rose from the rubble as though the city itself was tearing open. We covered our ears, but the sound wasn't just outside. It was inside us, rattling our bones. Petrov clutched his head, shouting over the noise, "They're everywhere!" And they were. Shadows poured through the ruins like smoke given shape. Women in tattered dresses, hair drifting like it floated underwater. Children, small and pale, their mouths open in silent cries. Soldiers, German and Russian alike, staggering with wounds that should have killed them. They walked among us. They didn't touch us. They didn't need to. One soldier bolted into the night, rifle forgotten, chasing after the shape of his wife. Another fell to his knees, sobbing, as the figure of his dead son reached for him. Petrov fired his rifle into the air, screaming at the phantoms to leave us be, but the bullets passed through like smoke. The screams never stopped. They built and built until it felt like the city was splitting apart. I pressed my face into the snow, hands over my ears, praying for it to end. But even then, through the roar, I heard whispers. My name, my brother's voice, my mother's lullabies. At one point, I lifted my head and saw a river of figures flowing down the street, endless, streaming toward the Volga. Men, women, children, soldiers, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open wide, yet their feet never touched the ground. They drifted. They poured. The city was emptying itself, emptying its dead. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time broke apart. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The screams cut off like a blade through rope. The phantoms vanished. The city fell silent again, save for the distant crack of ice on the Volga. When morning came, the men were shattered. Some sat staring into nothing. Others refused to speak at all. A few had disappeared entirely, gone into the ruins, following voices only they could hear. I looked at Petrov. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling, but he managed to whisper, "This isn't war anymore, Kolya. This is hell." And he was right. Stalingrad had become more than a battlefield. It was a city where the dead refused to stay buried, and where the living were only guests. By November, the jaws had closed. Operation Uranus struck from the north and south, and the German Sixth Army was trapped inside the ruins with us. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time since the fighting began, we felt a surge of hope. The Germans were cut off, supplies strangled. Soon they would starve as we had starved. But that hope was short-lived, because the phantoms didn't care about uniforms. They came for all of us. I remember one bitter dawn, patrolling near a captured trench. Frost covered the earthworks. Rifles jutted from the snow like grave markers. We found German prisoners there, shivering, eyes wide and hollow. They didn't resist when we ordered them up. They didn't even look at us. One of them, a boy, no older than me, pointed to the trench wall and whispered, "Die Stimmen, sie sprechen noch." The voices are still speaking. At first I thought he was mad. Then I heard them too. Low, murmuring, echoing through the frost-crusted timbers of the trench. Not German, not Russian, just the same whispers I had heard since the beginning. The prisoners clutched their ears, some weeping, some praying. One suddenly bolted, clawing through the snow, screaming for his mutter. He vanished into the fog before we could stop him. Even the enemy had become victims of Stalingrad. Later, during a lull in fighting, I crept into a basement where both Germans and Soviets lay wounded, waiting for stretcher bearers. In the flicker of an oil lamp, I saw them, The dead. Not ours, not theirs, just dead. They moved among the cots, pale hands hovering over faces, eyes glowing faintly in the dim. The wounded whimpered, tossing in fevered dreams. Some reached up as if begging for mercy. Others screamed for relatives long gone. When the lamp sputtered out, the basement filled with darkness. And in that darkness, the moaning stopped. Not because the pain ended, but because the dead had taken their place. Petrov and I staggered into the street afterward. He spat in the snow, muttering, "Even they see it now. Even the fascists." And he was right. Word spread. German patrols firing wildly at empty air. Whole squads surrendering, not to us, but to figures only they could see. Officers whispering of men waking in the night to find their comrades staring blank-eyed, whispering with voices not their own. The encirclement turned the city into a cage, and inside that cage, the dead prowled freely. For once, there were no sides, no Russians, no Germans, just the living, trapped in a city that wanted us all. That winter, I realized something worse than fear of the enemy. I realized the Germans weren't just fighting us. They were fighting the same ghosts. And in Stalingrad, no matter your uniform, the dead were always stronger. By January, the city was ice and ruin. Smoke still rose from shattered chimneys. The Volga froze, a black scar running through the white. Our army pressed forward, block by block, house by house, driving the Sixth Army into its final corner. We should have felt triumph. The great encirclement had worked. The Germans were starving, surrender was near. But none of us felt victory, because Stalingrad itself had changed. The phantoms no longer crept only at night. They walked openly in daylight, drifting across frozen courtyards, standing in bread lines that no longer existed, pacing in bombed factories where no machines ran. I remember storming a German strongpoint in the ruins of a school. Inside, their soldiers crouched behind desks and chalkboards turned to barricades. But they didn't fight. They stared past us, rifles shaking in their hands. One pointed at the chalkboard and screamed in broken Russian, "Kinder! Kinder!" We turned. On the blackened wall, chalk words had appeared. A child's handwriting, neat and shaky. "We are still here." Petrov and I exchanged a look, neither of us daring to speak. When we advanced, the Germans dropped their rifles willingly. They seemed almost relieved to be taken prisoner, as if the ghosts terrified them more than we did. Later, as we pushed into the heart of the city, I saw them. Rivers of figures moving through the ruins. Soldiers in torn uniforms, civilians in rags, children barefoot in snow. They moved together, drifting eastward, always eastward, toward the Volga. Their faces were blank, but their mouths moved soundlessly, lips forming prayers or curses I could not hear. The men around me fell silent, weapons lowering as we watched. For a moment, the battle paused, Soviets and Germans alike staring at the same impossible procession. And then, as the artillery roared again, the phantoms scattered like smoke. When the final push came, the Germans broke. They came out of cellars and holes, hands raised, faces hollow, eyes haunted. They surrendered not to us, but to escape the city itself. Some begged us to take them quickly, before the others came back. One officer clutched my arm and whispered, "They follow us. They always follow." I knew what he meant. I had felt it too. When Paulus surrendered on January 31st, Stalingrad was ours. But as we stood among the ruins, the silence was worse than the gunfire had ever been. For in that silence, you could still hear them, the whispers, the footsteps, the cries that rose with the wind. We had won the greatest battle of the war, but no one cheered, because deep down, we knew the truth. Stalingrad belonged to the dead. We were only survivors, spared for reasons we couldn't understand.
The war ended. Stalingrad became Volgograd, a city of parades and monuments, rebuilt with marble and glass. Children play where we once crawled through rubble. Tourists take photographs in the squares where entire battalions bled to death. To most, the city is alive again, but not to me. I returned once, many years after the surrender. My hair had gone grey, my hands stiff with age. I thought I could make peace with the place that had nearly destroyed me. I thought I could stand by the Volga and tell myself it was just history now. I was wrong. The moment I stepped off the train, the air carried that same bitter smell, smoke and ash, faint but undeniable. Walking the streets, I heard the rattle of trams and the laughter of schoolchildren, but beneath it ran a deeper sound, a hum, a whisper, the heartbeat of a city that still remembered. I wandered through Red October Factory, now half museum, half ruin. Tour guides spoke of bravery and sacrifice, pointing at relics behind glass. But as I lagged behind the group, I saw them. Figures moving among the machines, flickering like old film. Workers clutching their chests, soldiers with rifles, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. They walked the same paths they had walked in 42. No one else reacted. It was just me. Or maybe I was the only one willing to admit it. That night, I stayed in a small hotel near the river. The city lights shimmered on the Volga, but the fog rolled in just as it had all those years ago. I opened the window, and for a long time I stood there, listening, and I heard them. The voices. My brother calling my name. Petrov cursing under his breath. The little girl whispering in the dark basement. I saw shapes moving in the mist, just out of reach. A procession drifting toward the water. Soldiers, civilians, enemies, comrades. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I closed the window, but the whispers seeped through the glass all the same. People ask me sometimes about Stalingrad, about what it was like. I tell them it was hell. I tell them it was fire and hunger and death. But I never tell them the whole truth. I never tell them that the city is still alive, that its ghosts walk in daylight, that when you stand in its streets, you are never truly alone, because the war ended for the living. But in Stalingrad, the dead never lay still.